As we're kind of getting started, we'll give people another minute or two as we might have a couple people coming in. So we'll give them another 2 minutes and then we'll get started.
And I've got the waiting room, and I think I've got the record on, so whenever you're
Well,
good.
we'll get started then. We might have some people that are still coming in, but that's all right. As we're getting started, I just want to introduce myself really quick. My name is Allie Muschlitz. I'm a licensed psychologist at the Counseling and Mental Health Center. And I will add, as we're going through this presentation today, I might not be able to see kind of your chat. So I'm going to have Michael let me know if there's anything in the chat that comes up, unless it's kind of one of those times that I'll ask you to maybe share your thoughts. And I'm hoping that you're also a part of this conversation. I think it makes it more interesting. We can relate it to real experiences and apply it. So I will ask a couple questions along the way, and you're welcome to add that to the chat if you don't feel comfortable kind of talking through Zoom. That's all right. You're welcome to share on the chat as we go along. So as we're talking about academic performance anxiety. So you might be wondering to yourself, what does that mean? And what are we talking about here today? Well, my guess is you have some idea of the things that we're talking about. But I do want your thoughts. Like, what do you think about when you hear academic performance anxiety? Or where does it maybe show up for students? What are your thoughts on that? Any thoughts? I'm hoping, the thought of stress, right? Performance anxiety, stress might be something that comes up for you. Any other thoughts on academic performance anxiety? What does that mean? How does it show up? Where does it show up? What are your thoughts?
I think it fits into like imposter syndrome too, right? Like there might be some imposter syndrome that factors into not perform, kind of performance anxiety.
I would agree with that as well, right? If I don't feel like I'm competent in this area or I feel comparative to others less skilled, that might increase my anxiety related to a particular task or related to the area that I'm studying or trying to perform within, most definitely. Any other thoughts when you think about academic performance anxiety? Oftentimes people are talking about, I would say the most common one that comes up is test anxiety. But with graduate school, it might show up a little bit differently. And so we'll talk about that as well. But we'll start with a definition because I think, starting on the same kind of wavelength of our understanding is good. So what is academic performance anxiety? It is the sense of worry, intense stress, anxiety, or dread related to academic environments and responsibilities. So a lot of what we've been discussing, right? It's this idea of anything that causes anxiety, causes stress, causes us to worry, maybe feels like a significant level of distress related to academic performance. And that is meant to be kind of vague because it does show up in different forms for different people, right? There might be something that is more stressful for one student than another, right? One person may be more anxious by exams. Others may be more anxious by talking to their professor. So it really is vague for a reason. And so we'll talk a little bit of where this shows up, how this shows up, but just thinking about, yeah, that overall sense of anxiety, worry, stress, or dread related to academic environments and responsibilities. My staying suspicion is you have some thoughts on this that you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, I might be able to identify somewhere in my graduate school experience that this has shown up. As someone who has personally gone through grad school, I think this showed up quite a bit in many different areas. But for each of us, it might show up differently. And you might notice this even when you're talking with your friends or your peers, that the things that stress you out might be different than your peers. So I guess I would encourage you as we're having this conversation to think and kind of check in with yourself and think, where is this maybe showing up in my life? So the first question you might wonder is like, what kind of environments evoke this type of anxiety? Sometimes it's a particular task, other times it's particular environments. So we'll talk about both, but we'll start with environments. There might be a particular environment that evokes the sense of anxiety, stress, worry, right? So here are just some examples. This is by no means a limited list. These are just some examples of where it may come up for students. So might be a classroom, right? Maybe it's being around peers. Maybe it's worry about asking questions in class because you might not want to look a certain way. Oftentimes I have students who are like, well, I don't want to look dumb, or I don't want to ask something dumb, or I don't want to look like I'm not knowledgeable on this, even though I probably should be. So classroom, that's an example of one. The lab, maybe not feeling real skilled in a particular technique, or not feeling maybe good about the direction of your research, or maybe comparison, right? Maybe looking at peers' work in the lab versus yours, and that may be causing some stress or anxiety. Maybe it's a professor's office, right? A person of authority. That might be a stressful place. Or maybe it's just talking to a professor that might evoke that stress, worry, anxiety. But again, this is just some examples. There might be other types of environments that allude, or kind of elicit that particular stress or worry for you more so. And so I would encourage you to think for yourself, where does my stress show up? Are there particular environments that it's more present for you than others? Are there particular scenarios or situations where it arises more for you than others? And thinking and checking in with yourself about your own experience of anxiety within academics and where that tends to show up. And similarly, like I said before, it could be an environment, but it also could be a particular task, right? There could be particular academic related tasks that cause more stress or anxiety than others. Again, not an exhaustive list. These are just examples. Exams, tests, or quizzes, like I mentioned earlier, it's not uncommon for people to report feeling the test anxiety, that maybe they're really good at certain tasks, but when it comes to tests, quizzes, exams, that's where they feel like they struggle the most. For others, it's things like essays. One not listed here, dissertations. Whew, a big one that we talk about with graduate students for sure. The worry and anxiety with dissertations is often a common one for graduate students. Could be a particular assignment that you feel less skilled in or feels a little large or overwhelming. Group projects, again, kind of like I mentioned before, maybe worried about your skills comparative to peers, or not wanting to look a certain way to peers. Presentations, ooh, that is a big one. I talk to students all the time with regards to stress or anxiety around presentations, and some of the anxious worries that come up with that. And so these are, again, not an exhaustive list, but just some ideas to kind of get you thinking of like, what kind of tasks for you tend to evoke more stress or anxiety? I imagine as we're having this conversation, you're thinking, oh, yeah, this is the thing. This is the thing that tends to cause more of that for me. I would actually really love to kind of hear your guys' thoughts on things what are types of environments or tasks that cause more stress or anxiety for you? I think you probably list more than one. If for most grad students, there's more than one thing that is a bit stressful. I'm surprised I haven't heard dissertation yet. Usually that's the biggest one. And I will admit, my grad school experience, that was a very stressful experience. Other thoughts on like environments that you feel like your stress or anxiety increases, or particular types of tasks that cause a higher level of stress or anxiety? Well, I'm not seeing anything, but I would really encourage you, if you have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them, because sometimes as we're going through, especially when we're talking about strategies, it's helpful to know what are the things that are most prevalent for you, and maybe we could have more of a conversation to curate that.
I think maybe we can include here also like the oral presentations. For example, when we're going through the committee member meeting, like also a little bit of stress because you want to show yourself that you have enough knowledge or you're doing the correct experimental setups.
Most definitely, yes. Presentations to your committee members, or presenting your research that you're in the process of doing or finishing up, very stressful. Yes. I appreciate you sharing that. All right. We'll keep moving along. So now we're going to start to talk about strategies. Now, you might notice as we start going into this, we're going to start a little bit broad, and then we're going to go a little bit more strategic. So as we're kind of going into this, you might notice that trend, but I do think it is important to talk about the bigger things and then talk about maybe more specific strategies that may or may not be beneficial for you. So you might be shocked by this. As someone who counsels a lot of students, both undergraduate and graduate students, this is often the thing I'm checking in with students the most, because, if we don't have these really basic things covered, it makes it hard to address the anxiety, right? Because, we might have great strategies to help reduce that stress, worry, or anxiety, but a lack of sleep, a lack of good, consistent nourishment, and a lack of physical movement, whew, those can definitely exacerbate any sense of, stress or anxiety. I always joke that hangry is a real feeling, right? If I'm not eating, I might struggle more to regulate my emotions because I don't have the necessary nourishment to help me have the energy to be able to address those emotions or help regulate them. Same thing with sleep, that's another area. I think we can all think of somebody in our lives who didn't get enough sleep at some point and was kind of cranky or was a little bit irritable. That's a real thing. Again, making sure that we have these really basic things in place so that we have the kind of necessary components to be able to address the stress or anxiety. We don't kind of have those necessary components, it makes it hard to do that. So with sleep, recommendation is 7 to 9 hours for ages 18 to 64. That's usually encompassing most of our graduate students in terms of the age group. And I think one thing that I encourage is sometimes people, the other day I was talking to someone who describes sleep as a luxury. And, we talked about reframing it as a requirement, because, sometimes we have students who are staying up in order to accomplish a task, in order to study for exam, in order to be prepared. But what the challenge is if you're kind of reducing your sleep, whatever you're attempting to learn, your cognitive ability to take in that information and really sink that into memory is impaired. So, it's kind of counterintuitive if you're staying up, a majority of the night in order to study for exam, because we know sleep is really a helpful piece with memory. And we also know having a lack of sleep can impair that memory kind of synchronicity and impair cognitive abilities. So oftentimes I'm talking to students as this is a requirement, not a luxury. Nourishment, sometimes when we have a lack of time, we've got a lot of things going. This is one that's easy to kind of go onto the back burner. It's not uncommon with students, when we get close to finals or a really big project, there's maybe feeling of less time to put forth towards cooking or getting, nourishing meals. And so that's, when we start doing food delivery or fast food. So thinking about these things for yourself and trying to add in consistent meal times every day, as well as a balanced eating pattern. And with physical movement, this is, I think, just an added piece that can help with some of our cognitive abilities, right? Sometimes when it starts getting darker out in the winter months, you may have experienced feeling a little bit low. Sometimes physical movement is a way to kind of help boost our mood and can help with attention. So, for example, research suggests that about 30 minutes of moderate intense exercise can result in improved attention immediately following physical activity. And this may be helpful to think about, right? Maybe there's something that's coming up for you that you want to be more attentive to, thinking about how could you utilize physical movement to help aid that. And then some additional we've covered the bare bones basics of what we need in order to address our stress and worry. But these are some things to consider as you're thinking about your stress and anxiety that may be helpful. Oftentimes when we feel stressed, when we feel anxious, worried, a sense of dread, I kind of describe it as we're kind of up here. We're kind of up here in our thoughts and our feelings, and we're not as much in the present moment with people. And so one strategy that can be really helpful is attempting to be more present. Now that can kind of go through a lot of different strategies that can help with that, but even just thinking through the mindset of like, how can I be more present in this moment? Or how can I kind of clue into what's happening in my environment more so and less with my current worries and stress? So that's one thing that can help reduce that a bit. Positive self-talk, oftentimes when we're feeling really anxious and stressed, our negative self-talk can arise. That could be feeling really critical about ourselves, feeling judgmental about ourselves. Example could be maybe I kind of fell behind and starting on a particular task, and maybe I'm really hard on myself, like, there you go, waiting till the last minute, or man, you should have done this weeks ago, right? I could engage in that negative self-talk, but it often is not very helpful and actually adds to that stress or anxiety. So sometimes trying to counteract that a bit or balance our thoughts by also having some positive self-talk as well. Maybe there were reasons that was hard to get started on that task, or maybe trying to redirect our thoughts of like, I still have time, or now, at least now I'm trying to work on this task. Trying to change a little bit the thought patterns there can be helpful. And I think what's helpful is, when we're thinking about positive self-talk, it doesn't have to be this really sunshine rainbows theme. You can also address the mistakes that were made. If I was behind in getting started on a task, it could be like, yeah, I was slow to get started, but I do have time and at least I've gotten started, right? So there is kind of a balance in how we can do reframing of those things. And offering yourself forgiveness, right? This is a really big one. Part of owning our mistakes is also maybe forgiving ourselves and trying to learn from that experience. If we're choosing to be really critical and really judgmental, for a lot of people, that often elicits shame, which means we tend to avoid that thing. We tend to avoid even thinking about that thing. So oftentimes, if we can own the mistake and try to change how we talk to ourselves about it, it can be very helpful. And forgiving ourselves for those mistakes can also be very helpful. And I think a really big one is focusing on the things that are in your control. Oftentimes when I'm talking to students about really anxiety-provoking experiences, stressors, challenges, and just kind of navigating these stressful experiences, the focus really is on all these things that are outside of our control. And I think that is important to acknowledge, but also oftentimes there's at least one or two things that are in your control. Could be, what can you do about the stressor? It could be, how do we interpret the stressor? Or it could be, how do we choose to look at it? So there are aspects that are in your control, and trying to focus on your attention on those things can be really helpful, because focusing on our things that aren't in our control isn't going to help us really make much movement. And last but not least, self-care. I think, it's thinking about oftentimes when we're stressed and worried, we tend to be taking less time to care for ourselves. And that could be, there's a continuum of caring for ourselves. It could be at a really basic level of like, I'm getting up when I need to, I'm engaging in hygiene and showering and things like that. Or could be somewhere on the other end of like, oh, I haven't really reached out to my supports because I've been so kind of, consumed by the stress or consumed by these, anxiety provoking thoughts or experiences. So making sure to make some time to take care of yourself and do the things that you know are helpful for you. I just wanted to check in. We've covered a few things so far, and I'm just curious if there's any, thoughts or questions so far. We're going to go more kind of, again, that more strategic route now, but we've kind of covered some more broad or more vague kind of concepts. I'm just curious if there's any questions or thoughts on this, or maybe things that you're already practicing that you find helpful. I don't know about you guys, but I have personally found it a very kind of stressful week this far. And as a result, I've been trying to engage in more personal activities that I enjoy that can help me, reduce some of that stress, get my mind off of it. So for me, one thing I've been getting back into is knitting. It sounds really simple, sounds really silly, but I tell you, it makes a world of difference for me, and I find it really helpful. I think that's that self-care. It's like I don't always have time for knitting. It's not always the main priority, but man, when I am feeling stressed, it is really helpful and something for me to think about for myself. Any other thoughts? So now we'll talk about some of the more kind of specific strategies. And these might be things that you're already thinking or already working on. It's just to give you things to think about or maybe think about on a different kind of thought process. So effective time management, that sounds fine and dandy. I think most of us are thinking about these, but maybe it's taking it to that next level and thinking more critically about the time that you have. Because sometimes, we're not always the best judges of our time use, and we're not always the most effective in how we manage that time. So, one thing I suggest to a lot of people, if they're saying, I need to make time for this thing that's really important, it's looking at your schedule, and maybe there was consistently always a time available that we typically kind of fill with miscellaneous things or in between things. A great example is, maybe I've got two classes, but there's an hour block between that I typically kind of just do whatever. It's like, okay, maybe I could take advantage of that hour block between these two classes to work on something or study for something. Planning ahead and being realistic with time estimates. Ooh, this one's a huge one. I would say particularly with graduate students. It's not just the planning, but I think the biggest part is estimating the time, being realistic about estimating the time. I think for most of us, if we look at a task, we're like, oh yeah, I could get that done in an hour. But if we were really honest with ourselves, we might say, well, yeah, if everything went perfectly, maybe it would be an hour, but knowing myself, maybe it typically takes a little bit longer. So trying to be more realistic, because that will also reduce some of that criticism too, because if you set yourself up for an expectation that isn't realistic and then you don't meet it, you might notice that internal criticism of like, well, you were supposed to get this done in this last hour and you didn't, right? So that can also help with that piece too. But also just knowing like, we're human. We're gonna need to take breaks. I might have to use the restroom. I might want to get, a glass of water to drink. I might need a snack. Or I might just need to take a break away from all of this, written content to just have a second for myself. Because as humans, we do need those things, despite what we may tell ourselves. I would say, especially with thesis dissertation work, really trying to break that down and creating a schedule that way. Because oftentimes when people are thinking about, a thesis or a dissertation, feels kind of like this big, overwhelming thing that's kind of looming over us. And so, really being able to break it down into small steps is very helpful for most students. And then trying to plan and schedule based upon those smaller tasks. Reducing task-generated interference. Experts at Cornell describe this as behaviors related to a task at hand, but which are unproductive and prevent successful performance. Again, kind of vague, so I have some examples. So if I'm taking an exam and I'm constantly checking the clock to a level that actually maybe interferes with the time I have to do the test, then that might be a task that's generating interference for me to take that exam. And this can show up in many different ways. It's thinking about what are maybe small things that are interfering with tasks that you're trying to get done. An example for a lot of students is, okay, I sit down to work on something, but I feel constantly distracted by my phone. So it's like, okay, maybe we put the phone somewhere that it's not as easily accessible, or we put it on, airplane mode or do not disturb. That's just an example of something as well. But thinking about for you, what are maybe things that are interfering with your ability to complete the task or be consistent in attending to it? Managing physical experiences of anxiety. This is a really big one. Oftentimes when we feel anxious, we feel it in our bodies, right? We feel that tension somewhere. We feel that heartbeat racing a little bit more. We might notice that our breath is not quite as in sync or is a little bit faster. We might notice that we're a bit more jittery or we need to use the restroom more. So there's, anxiety is definitely a physical experience as well as a kind of mental and cognitive experience. And so thinking about what are relaxation techniques that you could utilize to help kind of relax ourselves. I like to think about it as, our body is a very automated process. We don't have to think about breathing. We just do it. Same thing for a lot of our bodily experiences. Those are really automated. And so this idea is kind of going from an automated process to a more manualized process, right? I'm going to take a manual takeover and try to practice relaxing my body so that I can have a slower heartbeat, a more normal heartbeat, to slow down my breath so I have a more normal breath. And funny enough, when we can start to control our physical experiences of anxiety, it oftentimes helps reduce the overall experience of anxiety for most people. And so this can be very helpful. Now, relaxation techniques, it's a wide variety. And so I would encourage you, try a couple different kinds, see what one works for you. Some people really enjoy breathing exercises. A really common one we talk about is box breathing. So it's kind of helping focus in on that breath, but also helping slow it down a little bit so that it's at a more normal pace. Another one is meditation. I often, if someone's starting to do that, I encourage them to find some guided meditations. Make it easy on yourself to get started and you can follow along. And this is kind of more of this relaxation of the body. But what also is really helpful about meditation is oftentimes they're asking you to kind of relax your mind and kind of clear your mind, which can be very helpful in us getting skills and strategies to be able to be more in control of our thoughts. Oftentimes we might feel our thoughts are in control of us. This is a strategy that can help us be more in charge and be able to manage our thoughts a little bit better. Mindfulness techniques or grounding techniques as well can be very helpful to help connect us back to that present moment and to connect to our bodies or the particular environment that we are in. Either way, there's lots of different techniques out there, and I would encourage you, try one, see how it goes. Try it for a week. If you consistently do it for 5 days in a row, even if it's only for 3 minutes, you might notice a considerable difference. And then the last one here, kind of going back to something we talked about, right? trying to increase positive self-talk means maybe we need to manage that negative self-talk, right? Again, when we feel anxious, worried, stressed, it's not uncommon for us to feel really judgmental or critical of ourselves in those moments. And trying to balance that with positive self-talk can be very helpful. Also being aware of what are your go-to thinking errors. Maybe it's more of a black and white thinking. Either everything is terrible or everything's wonderful, or maybe it's feeling like it's a catastrophe. Like when stressful things happen, it's like the end of the world. It feels like not actually the end of the world, but can feel that way, right? So thinking about what are your tendencies or your thoughts when those negative self-talk kind of arises. I think a big one, that I would encourage is self-compassion. I don't think this is something we talk about a lot more societally, but I do think it's a very helpful skill. If you're ever interested in kind of looking into this more, there's an expert named Kristen Neff who does a lot of great work on this, has some books and some materials online that you can find. But it's really thinking about, think about a good friend of yours. Think about if they're going through kind of a hard time and the compassion that you might put towards your friend, right? Now imagine kind of pointing that compassion more inward. And I think what's really nice about that analogy is it's not only this idea of the compassion you would hold for others and holding it for yourself, but also a good friend tells you the truth, right? Like they don't, they're going to be honest with you. If you mess up, they're going to say like, yeah, it does seem like maybe we missed a step here, but you've had a lot going on or you've been kind of balancing a lot. So it makes sense that this would happen, right? So it's holding kind of compassion, but it doesn't have to be overall super kind of beyond kind of positive. It can be a balanced perspective. Then the last two, big one is avoid avoidance. Whew. When we feel stressed, worried, or anxious about something, you know it. We are going to try to avoid it like the plague. This is where a lot of times you'll hear people say, I have a tendency to wait to the last minute to get something, but man, it's great once I get it. You might wonder, like if you're kind of a last minute doer, you might be thinking, well, maybe there's something about this task that is anxiety provoking, which is maybe why I'm avoiding it. But if I'm avoiding it, when I do finally get to it, it might be more stressful because I'm more time limited. So this is something to think about. Some great things to consider is addressing the task early, maybe knowing it's a task that you might feel more anxious or stressed about. Trying to take some steps early may be helpful, or just start by taking simple and small steps towards the task. Even if you feel like you've broken it down into small tasks, if you still are feeling anxious or avoidant, maybe even bring it into even more simple tasks or even smaller steps. With dissertations, for example, that's often what I talk to graduate students about. And sometimes it's like, okay, today I'm going to spend an hour working on it. But I'll be honest, sometimes I have graduate students who are so anxious even by that idea that we say, I just want you to spend 10 minutes today. And if you can do that, that's awesome. And of course, I'm sure you're already thinking it. The comeback for most graduate students is, well, that's not enough. It's like, well, maybe that's more than we did yesterday. Maybe it's progress, right? At least we're making a movement in the right direction. Because if we don't start taking those small steps, then we might be in a world of even more hurt. So that would be something I encourage you is even if it feels really anxiety provoking to an hour, maybe even breaking it down to something more simple and more frequent, right? Like maybe I do 10 minutes and I take a 10-minute break. And then I come back for another 10 minutes and take a 10-minute break. Whatever you feel like will at least get you going on the thing that's really stressful. Because the more we avoid, the more that anxiety builds. And then building upon your study skills. Sometimes I do get pushback from graduate students on this, but I think we're all, prone to maybe not the best study habits sometimes. That doesn't mean some of yours aren't really great. But just thinking about your own study habits, sometimes we can benefit from reflecting on our habits and building upon those study skills. There are also resources on campus. I always like to highlight this because not every, we don't always think about these resources. Academic coaching has been really helpful for some students, particularly around planning and organizing and trying to build a schedule for yourself. The writing center, oh my gosh, I've had a lot of great, stories from students about how this has been really helpful. I can really connect to this as well because, I don't think when, I have a doctorate degree, I think I've done pretty well. I don't think I'm a bad writer, but man, comparative to my oral skills, I do think that my writing skills are not as good. So, being able to utilize resources like the Writing Center can be helpful in reducing maybe stress or worry related to our writing ability. And then COGS programming. I'll show some information on COGS programming happening, but I would encourage you to utilize the resources you have as it may be really helpful or beneficial. And then the last is just consider opportunities for mentorship. You've got professors, you have students who are more advanced than you. There might be people who are in the career field or that attend conferences as well. But you might, find somebody that you might seek mentorship from and ask, what was helpful for them during grad school? How did they attempt to kind of balance these things? Or, how did they attempt to do their dissertation, or getting advice on the things that are really anxiety provoking for you. And again, here are some of the COGS workshops. I would highly encourage you to check this out. There is so many great resources here. There's the how-to series, which I think always has really great content from what I can see. But here, utilize the resources you have. That would be my best advice. And you've got a lot of resources here to help support you. And of course, being from the Counseling and Mental Health Center, I'm of course going to plug us because, sometimes our anxiety is really overwhelming and does feel like it's taking over our lives. And if you feel like that, Counseling and Mental Health Center may be a helpful resource for you to help kind of start thinking about and addressing those experiences of stress and anxiety. Sometimes I get students who are like, well, I don't feel like I need to, but I think I could benefit. It's like, yes, please reach out to us. There is kind of a false narrative out there sometimes that it takes weeks to get into us. That's not true. I will just tell you that now. Usually the most it's 2 weeks. So most students are able to get in before 2 weeks, but usually the most that you'll have to wait for an appointment is 2 weeks. And we do offer crisis same day appointments. So if you ever feel like you're in a place of real distress and need to talk to someone immediately, we do have that during our business hours. And so here is just some contact information so that you know a little bit more about the Counseling and Mental Health Center. And last but not least, I want to open it up for questions. And here is my contact information too. If you don't feel comfortable bringing up your questions today during this presentation, you are welcome to reach out to me. But if you do have some questions you would like to share, I would love to hear them, or even just your general thoughts.
I wanted to thank you for the